Hey guys, welcome to my first tutorial. Today, I'm gonna show you how I set up my interior scenes in Cinema 4D and Redshift. I show you how to achieve an overcast light mood as seen on this image. Sorry for the cheap text-to-speech audio, but I didn't manage to set up a mic yet. At least I have an awesome voice for once. Anyway, let's jump right in. When I do simple rooms or corners, I always start with a simple cube. I recommend the plugin drop to floor to align the room and its floor to the actual ground. Next step is extruding the walls. Now let's change the output resolution to portrait format. After adding a Redshift camera, I start with a rough framing. In my opinion, a focal length of 50 or more looks best for an image like this. Make sure the camera has no weird angles. A good starting point is to align the important elements to the rule of thirds or the golden ratio. This doesn't work all the time though. For the windows I am using the Windows Generator plugin. It's not free, but it really helps to set up windows very quickly. You can always enhance the geometry by hand if needed. The good thing here is, it is parametric. So you can change all the dimensions and details at every time. You have to replace the standard shaders with your own Redshift shaders though. You can do this in the Textures tab of the plugin. I will work with a window preset I've built earlier. It already has proper Redshift materials assigned. For the window glass material, I disable refraction by activating thin-walled, because this could cause problems later. So we go with a fake glass here. This window glass shader is a mix of two materials, glass and dirt. You can combine multiple layers of different materials with the Material Blender node. The dirt layer is just a gray diffuse material. Next step is setting up the basic lighting. Let's place a portal light behind the window, pointing inwards the room. It should have the same size as the window opening, or a bit bigger. If the window has multiple glasses, you can just use one single portal for the whole window, instead of many separate portals. Now let's set up the main light source. In most scenarios I go with the Redshift Sun and Sky rig. Most people are working with HDR images for more accurate results, but I think the sun and sky rig can do a great job as well if you set it up correctly. But before I start the interactive rendering, I'm gonna throw some basic textures on my room. I'm using some plaster and metal shaders from earlier projects. Don't forget to use cubic mapping here to avoid stretched textures. Group the window and the portal, so you can move everything quicker. Now let's have a look at the render settings. In the GI tab, select Brute Force and Irradiance Point Cloud. Type in a number between 4 and 12. In many cases 4 is enough, but if you have complicated light scenarios, higher values might be necessary. The number of rays is one of the most important settings. For interior scenes, I'm always cranking up this number to get a clean result. Depending on the room, a value between 1000 and 7000 is needed. You can leave the Irradiance Point Cloud settings on default. If you render in very high resolution, you should crank up this value to avoid endless render times. Now we have to increase the trace depth for reflection and refraction. This is important to get proper reflections and refractions on objects like vases or glasses inside our room. The single window glass already needs 2, for example. If you are looking through a vase later, it needs 6, and so on. The unified samples can be set to 16 and 64 if there's no depth of field or motion blur in the scene. To avoid fireflies, I decrease the secondary ray intensity to 2 or even 1. This will clamp the highlights a bit, but you can boost them in post if needed. Now we override the samples for reflection and light. It's actually better to tweak the samples individually for each material in the scene to get better render speed. But the override method is faster to set up. You can lower this value until you can see noise in the render, and then cranking it up again. That's it for the render settings. Now I add a cool plant to the scene. I'd like to point out that realistic models and shaders are key for photorealistic renderings. So you better buy high-quality assets or invest enough time in modeling objects. If the models and shaders are bad, the image can't look real, no matter what you are trying later. I would say 90% of the photorealism has nothing to do with the render settings. I think we need another object to interact with our room. I'm often browsing through a website called sketchfab.com. They have many awesome 3D scans of statues and other stuff. And many of them are for free. Since I love statues and ancient-looking stuff, I will now add a free one to the scene. Alright. Now let's fire up the interactive rendering and see what it looks like. Now, this looks like shit. What a surprise. So I'm gonna add some texture to the statue and tweak the room materials. I want black walls, so I'm adding a layer node to my wall shader and multiply the texture. Way better. But too dark, so let's tweak the settings in the PostFX. Here we can already work on our tone mapping. It's important to make some radical color corrections to get cool results. I am always using some LUTs inside Cinema 4D. And after that I'm gonna add some post-processing in Photoshop. I warmly recommend the LUTs from Kimmaland. You could also download the Corona image editor. It comes with many great LUTs, including the ones from Kimmaland which I am using here. In the portal settings we have to disable effects specular. Otherwise we can only see the portal on glossy objects instead of the exterior. You can increase the intensity multiplier exposure to get more light into the room. But be careful. It can look wrong pretty quickly if these values are too high. In case the room is still too dark, better increase the exposure in the color controls of the PostFX. Now let's move the sun and find a nice incidence of light. The lighting still sucks. The problem is the overly sharp shadow from the sun. First we have to increase the turbidity value to something around 6 or 7. Better. But I don't like that yellow tone. So I lower the saturation to something around 0.2. Much better. Sometimes I increase the sky intensity, which will result in a slightly overexposed exterior. Okay. We're slowly getting there. But the shadows are still too sharp. So let's increase the shadow softness. Next thing to do is tweaking the sun ray intensity. At the moment it looks like it's overcast, but with some holes in the clouds so the sun can shine through. This can be nice, but not for our scene. So let's decrease the visibility of the sun rays. That looks much better. Let's rearrange the composition a bit. I think the plant will look nicer when it is closer to the window. Yeah. And how about adding a nice wooden floor? This will add some warmth to our scene. We have to adjust our colors and tone mapping a bit. The floor is too bright now. Now I'm gonna add a nice backplate. Check out the plugin called Image to Plane from the Pixel Lab. It allows you to load bitmaps into the scene and automatically adding it to a plane, which then has the same ratio as the image. Since it is creating a standard Cinema 4D material, I will use the Redshift material converter. With a Redshift object tag, we can now disable the backplate's ability to cast shadows. Now let's apply the new shader to the backplate. I think I want to move the window a bit, to get a nice shadow in the corner of the room. Cool. Next, I'm gonna add some forester trees to have some exterior objects reflecting on our interior objects. Even though we cannot actually see them in our scene, I'm adding them anyway. Who knows, maybe I want to move the camera later. Now we add a baseboard. You can extract the basic shape with a loop selection of the floor, and throw it in a sweep object. Well, the style of the molding doesn't actually match the modern windows, but who cares? Alright. Let's try how it looks if the floor has no color at all. Like gray or black. Maybe it looks cool. Nope, I like the colored version better. So let's undo this. Okay, I think this is it. We're done. Time for a coffee. Let's render this in 3K, and see you guys in Photoshop for the post-processing. Here we go. I am now in Photoshop for the retouching and color grading part. My version of Photoshop is set to German, but I hope you can follow the steps anyway. Let's have a look at the raw render. It seems like the image is pretty clean after 20 minutes of rendering on 2 GPUs. There is a tiny bit of noise left, which we will eliminate with the Neat Image Denoiser plugin. Of course you can use Altus or Optics directly in Redshift, but I prefer denoising in post. And in my tests the Neat Video Denoiser did the best job in preserving texture details. So let's duplicate the layer and run the Denoiser plugin. The plugin has some good presets to start with. In this case I can just apply the preset called Recover Fine Details. Since the render was pretty clean, I reduced the opacity of the denoised layer and merged both layers. After making a copy, convert the new layer into a smart object and run the camera raw filter. Since the image looks a bit flat, I will now enhance the contrast and balance the colors to a more dramatic look. This process is individual for every image. There is no preset that works for all scenarios. So it's always a bit of experimenting and testing. Damn glitches. Now, have a look at this. The image is already much more interesting to look at. Of course, post-processing is always a matter of taste. Some people might want to keep it more subtle, but definitely not me. I am always looking for the maximum impact. Photoshop has some built-in LUTs that can look pretty cool. I'm often experimenting with them, mixing them to find out what they can contribute to my image. At 100% opacity, they are too aggressive. So let's bring down the opacity quite a bit. Add a curve to give even more contrast, and to clamp the dynamic range of the image. This gives a more photographic look to the image. The more you clamp, the more vintage it will look. Now let's play with the color balance to give a more unique vibe to our image. Next step is sharpening. Redshift is rendering very sharp images, but I always push it a bit further to make every detail pop out. I'm doing this with the high-pass filter and different overlay modes as soft light and overlay. For the first layer I use only 40% opacity, and bigger radius in the high-pass filter. For the second layer, which has 100% opacity, I use a smaller radius of 1 or 2, depending on the image resolution. Soft light blending mode with 40% opacity for the first layer. And overlay blending mode with 100% opacity for the second layer. Now I'm gonna add some atmosphere with a bunch of God rays. Just use the brush tool and paint some white rays on a new layer. The effect from the camera raw filter looks a bit too extreme on the wood. So I decrease the opacity of the layer in the lower area. Now we will add some additional highlights and shadows. The easiest way to do so is with a masked curve. Check this out. I name them with minus and plus, so I can see what each layer is doing. Minus for shadows, plus for highlights. But you can also call them apple and banana. This is a very artistic task, so you can really bring life to your image here. Or, if you are doing it wrong, destroy it. Object masks would definitely help here. But I am a lazy guy and therefore just go with a single image. What a shame, isn't it? Time to bring back some details in the highlights and shadows. Just a tiny bit. Now I'd like to add some bloom in the windows. By using the Color Range tool, I can easily mask the brightest spots in the image. Using this selection as a mask, I can then fill a new layer with white color and add a Gaussian blur filter. I will now tweak the colors of the plant and the flora with the Selective Color tool. Let's add some more bloom on the statue by hand. You can do this with a soft white brush. Almost there. But I feel like I want to add some more shadows to create even more depth. Great. But the shadows look a bit too cold. Let's give them some warmth. Perfect. Now let's flatten the image, copy it, and bring it back into the multi-layer file. So we have the final image on a separate layer. I should probably clean up my document a bit. Now there are some hot pixels in the wall due to the sharpening process. Let's reduce them. I'm using the clone stamp for this, with darken as overlay mode. Now there's only one step left. Adding some lens distortion to get a more analog feel to the image. You can do this in Photoshop. Check it out. Now we have some chromatic aberration. Maybe a bit too strong, but you get the idea. Alright, that's all folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can follow me on Instagram and Behance. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in the comments. Happy rendering, bye.